Yesterday, a fellow over at Reset Era leaked a treasure trove of data. It was the life-to-date revenue and life-to-date download totals for every major territory of PlayStation Network. So this is all digital. And this goes all the way back to 2008, I believe. I mean, this is some shit. I have no idea how much more is coming. I don't know why this came out now. Did the hackers release it and this guy got it first and just compiled it? Or was this always there and no one knew what to look for? I have no idea. But there's a lot to talk about with this, and I want to first be really clear on a couple of things. We have to be careful if your real goal is information, because there's a lot of narrative that is not represented here. And so people who were out there saying, this, see, I told you this means this, maybe not so much. Here's a great example. Somebody posted this on Twitter. SIE leaked, drawn to death, the PlayStation Studios published PS4 exclusive, blah, 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 which was the last game I shipped, has only sold 3,850 copies. And this guy's like, why is that why Jaffe's so salty? Well, no, I'm not salty. I just was like, oh, okay, I guess my vision doesn't connect anymore with people. That's fine. Time to get off the stage. But what's interesting here is it's like, if you only go by the numbers that you see on this sheet, of course you would say, yeah, he's right. But the fact of the matter is, again, Drawn to Death was a dismal failure. I'm not trying to buttress it up. I'm using it as an example for why you need more data for some of these numbers to really assess, properly. But with Drawn to Death, the budget was around 10 to 14 million. I don't know if you throw in PR or a little bit of marketing, but let's just say it was 12. That seems about right if I remember. And there was a huge portion of that budget. I won't give you the percent, but a meaningful percentage of that budget that was covered by the PlayStation Network. Now, again, it's still Sony money, but we as a game and as a developer and publisher made that money back. Not all of it. It was a failure, total flop. But we made a large percentage of the money back before we even shipped, because if you remember, we launched day one like Rocket League did. And that was the only similarity with Rocket League on PSN, right? So PSN were like, okay, we want this title. We want it day one. We'll pay you this. So while the game was a flop, 3,850 doesn't mean that that's the only number of people who played it. My point is just be aware that when people are out there telling you the stories behind these numbers, we don't really know. Another thing that's really fascinating about this is all the data is digital downloads. It's PlayStation Network, right? And the data goes back to 2005. So you really get to see the worm turning when it comes to digital becoming the predominant way people get their games. A good example of this is like Uncharted 4 right here. You would be forgiven if you just took the numbers at face value. Uncharted 4 launched in 2016. It has made $87 million as of June 2003. So these numbers are still a year old or so. And these guys have done about 3 million downloads of Uncharted 4. Okay, well, you'd say, well, that's not bad. It's pretty good, but I thought Uncharted 4 was the shit. Well, it is the shit, but Uncharted 4 is a game that came out in 2016, right? So the data that we have on that digital shift, where digital became and has become and stayed the dominant form, if you look at this on Statista, they go back to 2019. I think anybody looking at these numbers right here would be correct in assuming that, let's just say a 70% average is kind of where 70-30 split is where we're at, right? So if you go back to Uncharted, well, what percentage of this was digital and what percentage of the total sales was physical? So given that Uncharted was 2016 and most of the full price sale of that title happened before these charts that we're looking at, and we know that it was at best 50-50 digital physical, but back with Uncharted coming out, it was probably more like 30% digital, 70% physical. then you can look at this and go, wow, 3 million downloads. That means there were probably 8 million, 7 to 8 million actual physical sales, right? So you have to take that into account as well, which is why it's hard to look at some of the comments where people are like, see, look, Last of Us 2, biggest revenue earner, second biggest revenue earner. And that's clear from the numbers. You can't argue with that. But the narrative of going, see, it wasn't the flop. It didn't perform under expectations. You still can't really say that because all the information you need to make a statement like that, you're not getting it here. So the real problem with these numbers is you can make them mean whatever you want, because how much of the percentage of downloads were from when more of the download market was only 30% versus the 70% it is now. Some of these games that were done earlier cost less. Last of Us 1 cost less than Last of Us 2. Last of Us 2 sold for $70. Last of Us 1 sold for $60. Certain games have been on sale longer. Certain games have benefited from price cuts and being part of the PlayStation Plus Classic Collection. It's hard to really read any of this and walk away with any. There's one walk away that I think is valid, or there's a few. But when someone looks at this right now and says, oh, this means that they should make Last of Us 3 based on these numbers, they should just keep doing what they're doing. People loved it. I mean, I loved it, but there has been talk that maybe, oh, that title went a little bit too, quote, woke, whatever. You know how I feel about that. I do not like the Horizon Forbidden West series, right? Or the Horizon series. So it's easy for me to look at these numbers and go, see, I'm right. Horizon Forbidden West shows that it's actually a pretty weak franchise. It's only number 16 in number of downloads. And maybe that's true. It may very well be true. If you look at Horizon downloads 6 million, Horizon Forbidden West 2 million. Now, yeah, there's been a large gap between when Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 came out. Horizon 1 had a lot more time to sell, but how does that compare to other similar games that had just as much more time to sell for their sequels, right? I would argue that the 6.2 and the 2.3 difference is much more of an indication that Horizon is in trouble as a franchise compared to the God of War 8.1 million and Ragnarok's 4.2 million, right? So it's a 50% drop in roughly the same amount of time, whereas this one is a 60% drop. But again, these are just guesses and you're filling in the blanks, and you have to know that your own confirmation bias is going to color these numbers in the absence of more information. So we don't really know, but we maybe kind of sort of know. Here are the two things I think, though, that you can walk away from this with. You can walk away looking at some things that clearly don't work. I think if you look at Death Stranding, that at this point had been out for 3.5 years, 1.5 downloads, 1.5 million downloads, 74 million in revenue. Again, the majority of which would be in the digital. Obviously, there was a director's cut that's on here somewhere, but it didn't move the needle dramatically. Returnal, I think, is obviously disappointing, right? Less than 500,000 downloads for that title. Brilliant fucking title. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, brilliant fucking title. Only 1 million copies at the time. What do you take away from that if you're Sony? Do you go, oh, the arty-farty stuff? Like, if they would have made Returnal a little easier, and don't fucking hit me in the comment, well, it is the easy thing. If you do this and this and this, there's actually a checkpoint. I understand, but most people aren't going to do this and this and this. Most people are going to die a couple times, wash out, and return to the goddamn game and tell their friends not to buy it. I'm not saying there shouldn't have been a mode that represented the purity of the vision, but sometimes there are director's cuts because there are director's cuts and the studio knows better. Similarly, Death Stranding. I don't know if they were contractually obligated to make a sequel, but ask yourself that. Ask yourself why the fuck they're putting out a Death Stranding 2 when this thing can't even clear 2 million in downloads. And that came out in 2019. Days Gone came out earlier. And it's around 11 million copies sold right now, anyway. And there's no sequel coming. So I'm just, it's clear that game didn't perform as well as people expected. But the bigger takeaway to me on this, this is interesting too, though. Look at Miles Morales compared to The Last of Us 2, right? Miles Morales, I'm just surprised that Miles didn't do as well as Last of Us 2 in terms of the download ranking, the number of downloads. I would have thought Spider-Man Miles Morales would have been higher, even though I know Last of Us 2 is this flagship. It's coming off this big hit, but so is Miles Morales. I know it's not Peter Parker, but did that matter to most people? I'm surprised. But then again, to be fair, Last of Us 2 came out in June and Miles came out in November. Yeah, but you would have had more time to sell. But maybe I don't know. That's what I'm saying. We don't really know. We don't really fucking know. But here's one thing we do know. Whether you're talking about these kind of more arty-farty games, or big games like Ratchet and Clank, Rift Apart that only sold, 1.6 million or whatever. But even if you go deep into the archives with some of these more unique, interesting games Sony used to make, what this points out, I think, is just how tricky it is now with AAA video games, that this market towards the top up here for the most part has really spun Sony away from what made Sony PlayStation. And I get it, because way back then, these were the AAA games. I understand. But I think you look at this shit and you go, I don't know if Sony should open like a boutique publisher for PlayStation, still exclusive, kind of like the movie studios do. But there's something wrong about this. There's something wrong about the fact that, you've got to spend this much to make this little. It's just, I don't know, man. It's just, imagine being Sean Layden back in the day when he first kind of rang the warning bell and said, this isn't sustainable. Because even with a massive fucking hit that you don't have to pay licensing fees to. So take Ragnarok, right? Ragnarok has made 280 million in digital. So that, let's just say it's made $400 million as of the leaks here. Probably cost 200 million. So you could say they made 200 million profit, which they did, but how much of that had to get spent off the shit that didn't hit or they didn't make their money back on? I don't know, man. I don't, I'm not saying that Sony should go back to making games that if you sold 1 million, you were a big hit, but I think what this shows is the audience out there for people who want to play video games at a core level, it's just, it won't work with this. So either this has to change in terms of this has to bring in a much bigger group of people, and it ain't going to come from production value, or you got to be able to let yourself go back and say, we're going to build a business around these. If we sell 1 million, we're happy as a pig in shit. Right? I don't see an upside at this point. It just seems miserable to be an executive trying to make these decisions. Ugh, no, thank you. But it's interesting. And like I said, this is kind of like a Rorschach test. Whatever you want to think about Sony or Xbox or PlayStation. Again, I'm not saying numbers lie. I'm not saying the numbers are meaningless. They're clearly not. But I definitely think that without some more nuance to these numbers, it becomes really easy for people to spin them however they would like them to be spun. A couple other things real quick. I think it's clear that you can see that Dreams was not a big hit, which is really shitty. But I mean, again, they I don't mean like I knew it, I told you, but a lot of us knew it. It's like, it was dead from the beginning because of some boneheaded decisions. 600, it sold probably 1.5 million copies, and that's ridiculous for something so innovative. They could have had Roblox, but what are you going to do? All you have to do is look at the Twisted Metal numbers in here. And again, the Twisted Metal, the last Twisted Metal was 2012, before when most of the stuff was retail. And so the downloads were much later. But even then you can look at the numbers and go, yeah, there's not a big audience for it the way that it has been. You'd have to retool that whole fucking thing to get that back. But the amazing thing though is if you look at some of the smaller games, if you look at some of the games like Journey, right? Journey, $12 million in revenue. And this is, most of Journey was only downloadable, right? That's pretty fucking good for a game that probably cost $4 million. Maybe. Certainly Flower and Flow, which were profitable, didn't cost anywhere near that. So the question really becomes, you know, I get that Sony PlayStation as they stand now, this is not sustainable to make a bunch of these games, but my God, that's, you know, there's a game company in here somewhere that really needs to extract itself from this $250 million bullshit and somehow bring that essence of just great games that are sustainable back. I think that's just, you know, you see it in the fucking numbers, and it's a real tragedy that that's not good enough. And it's not. I get it. You know, it's, oh, wow, we made $6 million in profit. Or more than that, actually, if it was $4 million, but whatever. Even if it was half, we made $6 million in profit. It's still 12. It's still nothing. It's still nothing. That's, you know, nothing compared to what you could make if you roll these particular dice. But, you know, what it is, what it is. That's great, Jaffe. One great takeaway. It is what it is. Well, it is what it, shut up. Point is, there's some numbers, do with them what you will. Let's move on.